Welcome to English 225 Classical Mythology. This lecture will cover the chapter called The Nature of Myth. Before we continue, let me explain about guided notes. We have a lot of material to cover this semester and some of it is complex. You must read the textbook to be successful in the course, but there is no way you will retain enough critical information without taking notes. To make note-taking more efficient, I've provided guided notes. Before you watch any of the lectures, be sure to download and print the guided notes for that lecture. Then, as you watch the lecture, fill in the notes. Pause the video recording at any point, rewind when you need, take notes. Now on to the lecture. I like the quote by Sir James Frazer in your book. The longer I occupy myself with questions of ancient mythology, the more diffident I become of success in dealing with them, and I'm apt to think that we who spend our years in searching for solutions in these insoluble problems are like Sisyphus perpetually rolling his stone uphill only to see it revolve again into the valley. And that's how Powell begins The Nature of Myth. We all know what myth is in relative terms, but in this class we're going to go deeper. As Powell states, the Western Roman Empire ended more than 1,500 years ago. Still, in our century, the 21st, our culture is still full of references to the myths of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Hey, we even have movies based on some of those myths. In fact, that I know that each of you can name a number of god and goddesses and even heroes in the myths we will study this semester. Remember that these myths are much older than the written words that were handed down to us. Powell writes, they go back before the introduction of writing, an era when classical myth first took shape. He makes the point that storytelling is universal and the result of spoken language. All cultures in the world, since the beginning of spoken language, have told stories. Stories are a way of reminding listeners of their own values, beliefs, and origins, Powell writes. We need to explore the question, what is myth? Can you easily define it? Powell has spent a career studying myth, including all its meanings. Our book gives this widely agreed upon definition: a traditional story with collective importance. And by collective importance, we mean the story is important to a large group of people, a society or a culture as a whole. They hold meaning for the group, not just the individuals. As Powell states, they describe patterns of behavior that serve as models for members of society, especially in times of crisis. Be sure to read the specific examples from myth that Powell gives in this chapter. I like that he includes the definition of traditional, which is handover. We're dealing with stories that were handed over. Myths in ancient times were passed down by the Iodoi. These were skilled oral epic poets. They memorized these myths, often using poetic conventions and song, and told them to audiences as they traveled. He says that the term myth is hard to define. Part of it is because of all the types of stories that exist worldwide. The original Greek word mythos meant authoritative story or plot. Taking the meaning of mythos, we see that myths have the same elements that we're used to hearing when it comes to storytelling. Myths have plot. By plot, we mean that myths have action that take place. The stories we will follow this semester have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Maybe the plots aren't aligned the same way that we're used to seeing, like say in a creative writing class, but the myths certainly have action, tension that builds up, and a resolution. One thing you'll need to keep in mind is that we often say, for instance, that the Greek god Zeus is a myth. If we're being accurate, Zeus is a character in myth, but he is not the myth. Myths have characters. Of course, I don't have to define character for you. As I've just said, Zeus is one of the main characters in Greek myths. And finally, myths have settings. These stories we will cover have to take place somewhere. By setting, we're referring to the time and place of a myth. One thing we need to keep in mind, myths never take place in the present or recent past. Myths take place in the distant past, and as Powell notes, in a shadowy time altogether outside human chronology. Myths can take place in a physical place that humans know, or at some obscure place outside human experience. Again, I can't stress it enough. Myth is a story. It is not a being. So during the semester, do not refer to Aphrodite or Apollo as myth. They are characters we will be learning about. You can say myth of Aphrodite or myth of Apollo, but I will correct you if you say Apollo myth. Author or no author? That is another thing about these myths. Because they're traditional and originally handed down orally, there are no original authors for these myths. We simply do not know who created them, so they are anonymous. Modern works have authors, traditional myths do not. We are given the example of the play Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. While Sophocles did write the play, the myth or story itself had existed for a long time. We have no idea who came up with the story of Oedipus, and the ancient Greeks did not either. That's how old the story is. Ever played the telephone game? If you have, you know how original messages changes as it passes from one person to person. What you will find this semester is that for some myths, there are multiple versions. Which one is the correct version? Who knows? Those versions came about so long ago that we have no idea. Your book gives the example of Oedipus again. Homer and Sophocles have Oedipus kill his father and marry his mother. That's the same, but Homer has him still rule when the truth comes out, while Sophocles has him leave the city in disgrace. Keep in mind this semester, we will find some conflicting stories. Roll with it and pick whichever one you prefer. There are more Greek words to keep straight. Mythos means story, and logos means account. Why does that matter? Logos as an account means the teller is taking responsibility for the account being truthful, while mythos as a story means the teller is not personally responsible for truthfulness. This is important when we go back to the fact that myths are anonymous. There's no one taking responsibility for a myth's truthfulness. The next thing to point out is the suffix ology. Hopefully you all know that anything that ends in ology means the study of. Biology, study of biological life. So mythology is the study of myth, while mythos is the stories themselves. Paul makes a point that the teller of mythos is not taking responsibility for what is said, while we take the word account to be factual and truthful. Try to get in the habit of making the distinction between myth and mythology this semester. All right, let's go back to storytelling. In ancient times, stories depended on the oral transmission of information, including storytelling. As I mentioned during the telephone game slide, traditional oral tales change with each telling. On top of that, each storyteller has their own motives and purpose, and they emphasize different things than another storyteller might. Be sure to read the chapter and see the examples dealing with the stories of Niobe and Oedipus. Our textbook will focus on the best known variant of the story, but on occasion point out the variations to make us aware. It will cover Oedipus the most on that score.